fathers of science, a pioneering breed of theoretical physicists and inspired inventors, are challenging the way we think about harnessing the unseen forces of nature. Despite ridicule, lack of funding, and outright suppression, they are confronting an outmoded classical worldview and ushering in a monumental scientific revolution.
Most people would agree you can't get something for nothing. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And yet, we get our oxygen free from the air we breathe. We get sunlight free, and water, that used to be free until bottled drinking water came along. But what about energy? We've always had to pay for that, whether it's wood or coal, oil or electricity. It's always been the rule that you can never get back more energy than what you put in the first place. That's a fundamental law of nature. Physicists of the 19th century figured that out with the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy. Maybe so. But science has come a long way since then. And laws, well, there's never been one that hasn't been broken.
Well, first let's explain some things that are free energy devices and then give you a comparison to explain what we mean by free energy. For example, a paddle wheel in a river that's used to power a mill, grind corn, is a free energy device. So is a windmill, for example. What we mean is we are taking the energy from an external source and using it. So it's an open system, and the environment of the system is furnishing a flow of energy into the system, which the system is then collecting and using. Primary requirements: it has to be an open system, it has to have an external source of energy to furnish the energy that we're going to use, and therefore it's no more mysterious than a windmill. Well, today, the primary energy source we're talking about is the vacuum, but we're speaking of the vacuum in the quantum mechanical sense. It has been known now for some time that the vacuum is in fact filled with enormous energy flux. So there's no question that the energy is there. The question is extracting it and then using it in your system. It turns out, ironically, that everything we build, batteries, generators, and so forth, are already free energy systems insofar as extraction is concerned. There already is a process in every dipole, in every electric dipole or magnetic dipole, that automatically extracts and gates energy flow from the vacuum. The energy flow in electric circuits and in general in physics is very interesting. Much of physics, including all of electromagnetics, was already established before we had even the idea that energy flowed through space. This was simultaneously done by Poynting and also by Heaviside in the late 1880s. And the notion was extremely novel at the time that energy actually could flow through the vacuum or through space. Today, of course, we use that as a matter of fact. What is not so commonly known is that the application of tracking the energy flow in an electric circuit has never been very well done at all in physics. You will find that most of the electromagnetics textbooks, when they get to that point, how does the energy flow in a circuit, they actually do a very simple example or two show some simple calculations, and then never say anything about it again. Now, the Poynting energy flow, which is what it's called, is, of course, very well applied in things that radiate off into space, but it has been very poorly applied in electric circuits. And in fact, for over 100 years, there has been a continuing argument, basically a gentlemanly argument, amongst the electrodynamicists as to exactly what and how to apply. For example, they confuse different vectors, the Slepian vector, the Poynting vector, and they're still arguing over just exactly what energy flow in circuits are. So I would just want to point out that the actual energy flow in a circuit is not well accounted for at all or well understood even today.
James Clerk Maxwell, best known for his Maxwell's equations, is reputed to have set things straight with his theories of electrical properties in a way that eliminates zero-point energy. But Maxwell's more advanced work allowed for the existence of an ether, a substance finer than air, which since the time of Plato had been considered a scientific fact.
There's a strange thing that exists in electrodynamics. It was not diabolical and probably not even intentional in the way that in the thing that it did. And this is a thing to do with regauging Maxwell's equations, the Heaviside version of those. What they did, they expressed the equations in potential form, and you come out with two equations and two unknowns. But both unknowns are now embedded in both equations. In other words, the variables are not separated. So the electrodynamicists have done a regauging, changing the potential, so to speak, of those two equations. Well, when they change one potential, for example, the magnetic vector potential, this produces an E field also. It doesn't change the B field, but it produces an E field. So then they go in and they change the scalar potential phi to produce exactly the opposite E field and have the two E fields cancel. This gives what is called a symmetrical regauging. In other words, you change the potential energy of a system, which you're free to do. That's just energy transfer. It doesn't take work to do that. But you do not allow any excess force to appear to use that energy to do work on the system. Now, that is a symmetrical regauging. What that has done, this is the theory that they then apply to electromagnetic circuits and devices and everything in the world. But what this has done is excluded an entire class of systems, which is in fact covered by Maxwell's equations before regauging, that include systems which regauge and produce the force. In other words, asymmetrical regauging. Now, that class of systems which has been omitted from electrodynamics contains two further classes. One of those is the force produced will use that energy to hurt you. In other words, it'll give you back drag, it'll give you back EMF, that sort of thing. And so it'll hurt your system performance. The other subclass, the force appears in a way to help your system performance. It will use that excess energy and expend it on the system, for example, in the rotary engine, to increase the rotational speed and therefore the stored energy, kinetic energy in the system. Now, obviously, that is the class of systems that include over-unity electrical systems. In other words, the regauging occurs by the machine itself automatically. It takes excess energy in from the vacuum. It produces a force which the system designer places exactly in the system so that that force will expend that energy on the system to increase the kinetic energy of the system, and then we'll take that excess energy off as shaft power. Now let's explain how an electrical dipole, for example, as a battery or a generator, is able to take energy, extract it from the vacuum, and place it onto the conductors of the circuit. First of all, we go to particle physics. In particle physics, any electrical charge is automatically a broken symmetry. Now, what this means is there is a virtual photon flux, a violent flux exchange between the vacuum itself, which is filled with this virtual photon flux, being absorbed by the mass of this particle and then re-radiated back to the vacuum. And so the vacuum and any electrical charged particle are engaged in a fierce exchange of energy all the time, from the vacuum to the particle back to the vacuum. Now, that's not a gating process. It goes right back to the vacuum from the particle. But if you have two particles of opposite sign separated by a small distance, you have two different kinds of fluxes. And the difference between the two gives what we call scalar potential, or voltage in terms of an electrical circuit. But this means that one of those charges you can compare to a source, that is, actually the positive charge conventionally in electromagnetics is assumed to be the source charge. Energy from the vacuum is actually gated out of this charge into the conductors. It has the characteristic it'll flow along the conductor. We call that pointing flow along the circuit. It flows outside the wire in terms of field energy. The other end actually goes back into the wire and acts as a sink, but we also tend to illustrate that as a different kind of flow or different degree of flow from the bottom of the circuit. The difference between these two flows is basically what's called EMF, electromagnetic force, in a system. And so the dipole itself, the existence of the two opposite charges separated by a small distance, generates an actual flow of electromagnetic force, and it's not a force, it's a potential, in an electric circuit, and that's what powers the circuit. Now, by the way, that is the only function that a source does. All the rest of that stuff, the generator, the battery, everything in there, all that does is get you the separation of charges. Once you have these charges separated, the flow of energy from those charges is forever free, and it will flow forever if that's all you take from it, is flowing, pointing energy. So what we have done in our electric circuits is we take half of that energy that flows into the system freely from the vacuum through the dipolar source. In the circuit, we take half of that energy and we ram the so-called spent electrons in the ground return line back up through the source against its back EMF. We do work inside and on the ancillary stuff in the battery or the generator to destroy that separation of charges, thereby closing the gate that's given us our free flow of energy. It does not cost one copper penny for the generating capacity of a power plant to power a large city. The actual energy flow out into all the homes and the use to power the homes does not cost anything. The costs that we run into is when the power company pumps all of those electrons back through against the back EMF, does exactly that much work inside their own generator to fight it, and they engage in a sumo wrestling match inside the generator, and that's what we pay for. There is a question many times about, exactly what is the vacuum, exactly what is a potential, because when you get right down to it, these terms are either not defined at all in physics or very poorly defined.
The now famous Michelson-Morley experiment at the turn of the century failed to detect a stationary ether, so classical physics presumed once and for all that it did not exist. The case was closed until quantum mechanics reopened the discussion, allowing for a new interpretation of how matter interacts with a zero-point field. In fact, although skeptics often point to Einstein's theory of relativity, it was Einstein who in 1920 said,
"There are weighty arguments to be adduced in favor of the ether hypothesis. To deny the ether is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatsoever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view. According to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable."
The term vacuum has been used in several totally different senses. Some engineers use it to mean you just pump out all the air, and that's called a vacuum, and that's vacuum technology. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about empty space-time. We know today, for example, the Lamb shift in quantum mechanics showed that this exchange of energy between the vacuum and the charged particles is in fact real and generates real effects. And you can measure it, and he was given the Nobel Prize, Lamb was, for doing that kind of measurement and showing it in the physics literature. So we know it's real. Experimentally it's detected. The Casimir shift, for example, shows clearly that it's there, and it does generate energetic effects in your actual materials. It turns out that in the modern view, modern quantum mechanical view, if you apply that knowledge that's been gained there, what you find is that the vacuum is fiercely active. It's a fierce energy flux and going in all directions at all times. The energy density of that, as estimated by various physicists, is extremely high. For example, in 1 cubic centimeter, if you could take the raw energy in that cubic centimeter and condense it into mass, divided by c squared, you would have more observable mass result from that than our largest telescope can see in the observable universe and all the stars and planets today. And so the energy that's there is extremely dense and extremely fierce. This drives everything that we call physical reality, from the quantum level right on up to the observed level in the observed world that we live in. Everything is energetically driven by the vacuum. Now, as long as any point is totally in equilibrium, you would never have any resulting higher order emerge from that. So the emergence of the normal world we live in, the macroscopic world, already depends upon there being hidden order in this flow. That's called the problem in quantum mechanics of the missing chaos, the missing order. Because they assumed there was no order, they made quantum change random, and that does not generate the present world we all live in. You falsify quantum mechanics by simply listening to this videotape, adjusting your tie, or opening the window. So we know that it's wrong. It's admitted to be wrong in quantum mechanics now. The problem is we have to change the statistics that we use. We have to use an already chaotic statistics. Now, fortunately, a very good physicist named David Bohm showed that if you have hidden order, hidden variable theory, it's consistent with all the experiments that's out there. Nothing refutes it. It eliminates all the problems in quantum mechanics. As far as I know, Bohm never discovered how to actually apply hidden variables. What I have been doing is pointing out that the work that began with Stoney and Whittaker, Stoney prior to 1900, shortly before that, Whittaker 1903, 1904, later used a little bit by Nisbet, by Debye, and some by Dirac, for example. That work, when applied, becomes an engineerable hidden variable theory. And so you can engineer the stuff we're talking about if you look at it with the right set of theoretical eyes. It is doable in the laboratory, on the bench, with some difficulty. There is a problem today, a very serious problem, that's recognized by a few foundations physicists, those very few brave, hardy souls, who struggle with what this stuff really means at root level, what each concept and so forth means, and is it correctly stated, is it wrong, whatever. It turns out that the foundations of physics that we're using today is very seriously flawed, particularly in electrodynamics. I have one chart, for example, I often use in presentation that has some 25 very serious flaws in classical electrodynamics, the things we use to design our TV systems. So it's seriously flawed. It needs complete overhaul. It's over 100 and something years old. Maxwell did that stuff when the American Civil War had just started. So we're talking about something that old. The prevailing belief of the time was that the vacuum was a thin material fluid, the so-called material ether, which we know today is false. The ether is there, but it's not the observable material fluid. Another thing that was completely wrong in it was the assumption of a transverse wave. That's founded on a single thing. Faraday, who was a brilliant man that did most of the research trying to put electrical field together with magnetic field, Faraday had re-established this notion of lines of force, but he thought that in this material ether they were physical strings. He thought the electromagnetic field, or the electromagnetic disturbances in the ether, so to speak, was really twanging strings. The strings were under tension, and when you had a disturbance, what you really did was pluck the strings. Now, Maxwell states very clearly that he set about to actually capture exactly what Faraday was doing in his lines of force in the theory, and that's what he did. He actually did a thing where the vacuum is considered to be full of strings, which don't exist, material strings. If you re-examine the problem from first principles, you can find very easily that the actual electromagnetic wave in the vacuum flux is in fact like a sound wave. It's longitudinal. Now, Nikola Tesla, for example, knew this full well from his own experiments. For example, when Hertz reported experiments showing that he had finally discovered the wave that Maxwell's equations had predicted, the transverse wave, Tesla got on a boat, went to Europe, visited Hertz, and showed him experiments to refute that and show him that it was longitudinal. Hertz was not going to go against Maxwell and the prevailing idea of the day, and Hertz died not too long after that anyway. He had a short life, unfortunately. So the prevailing notion of the transverse wave in vacuum has no other substance than that. As a matter of fact, if you track the receipt of the signal in the electron gas in a copper wire antenna, for example, if you plug in today what we know to be the electron reactions, the fact that it has spin, it acts as a gyro, moves side to side, precesses, hardly travels down the wire at all, maybe 6 inches in an hour. If you actually plug all that in, what you will find out is it's gyro precession of the electrons that we're actually measuring. Now, the early fellows thought that the electric physical fluid shaking in the vacuum was intercepted by the wire, and since they measured transverse waves, they were measuring the fluid from the vacuum entering there. That's what they thought. The electron hadn't even been discovered yet. The molecule was just a blob. And so they put together the theory with all of that stuff missing. It's seriously in need of total overhaul. The solution to the problem in electrodynamics is to take some very sharp, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young graduate students who aren't afraid to climb Mount Olympia again and go at it from the very beginning, each part of it, each concept, and put in all the modern knowledge that we know about electron drift velocity, electron spin, all of this kinds of thing, and reestablish the theory, the foundations accurately. Put in the longitudinal wave that we can show exists. We would like to contribute the electromagnetic mechanism that generates the flow of time, because I published that obscurely. I'm going to publish it not so obscurely and more definitely in the future, but that should be in there because you can engineer that as well. There are many other things that should be in there that many of the foundation physicists also have pointed out. For example, electrodynamics assumes at each point in space there is a point coulomb of charge located there. And what the equations in the electric field establish is the way that point coulomb moves. It's considered to exist at a point. And the coulomb of charge is not allowed to have its own scalar potential, for example, which is false. If they're doing magnetic field, you assume there's a unit north pole sitting there. And the way that north pole moves in space is what the field predicts. Now, of course, that's nonsense. None of that exists in the space. So we should correct all of that again and overhaul this stuff that's over 100 years old. We have had magnificent success with the electromagnetics we have. There is a tremendous electromagnetics beyond that was omitted from Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's actual theory is 20 equations and 20 unknowns in quaternions, which is a higher topology algebra. You can do things in that you can't dream of in doing in tensors, and you certainly can't do in vectors, and you certainly can't do with the theory that's taught at our universities. All that remains to be rediscovered and uncovered. Heaviside and to some extent Gibbs are largely the two people, a little bit of Hertz, responsible for translating that into vectors and creating vector algebra in so doing. Most of what we study today is Maxwell's equations, not his equations at all. They are Heaviside's interpretation and subset. And so we reduce the topology of the model anyway from 20 degrees of freedom, so to speak, to 4 degrees of freedom. Obviously, we eliminated most of the electromagnetics when we did. You can do a lot of things today, actually, that are not taught in our normal universities and do not appear in the textbooks. Of course, anybody who is struggling with free energy, and we are struggling, although there are now some devices actually working that I believe have been sufficiently tested independently to verify those devices. I would certainly nominate the Patterson Sail as being one that can be demonstrated to actually be over unity without question. I think the Takahashi engine, the Kawai engine, Johnson has a new multi-valued potential use in his permanent magnet gates that I think will withstand the most rigorous investigation. So I think that some other engines, there are other things that I have not named that also appear to be valid and appear to be independently verified. What I'm saying is that we have certain things now which actually do produce over unity on call when you turn them on, and they do produce the effects. It has now become unquestionable. The question now becomes, so what happens when these start to spill out and enter, for example, the commercial market? Well, what is going to happen is really a tremendous revolution in energy right across the board. One of the things that's going to happen is a freedom from a lot of the costs that we have now associated with the production and use of energy. Billions and billions, even trillions of dollars every year. Another thing that will happen for the benefit is that we will clean up a lot of the burned hydrocarbon wastes out of the atmosphere. We'll recover our atmosphere again. We should be powering our automobiles, for example, on over-unity engines, clean and free, so to speak, without having to pay a tax at the gas pump and so forth to run the automobile. We will get the boot, the economic boot, off the back of everybody's neck in powering their homes. When you're able to actually procure a device for some kind of reasonable cost that will power your home for the heating and the lighting and everything only for the maintenance, then obviously that's a revolution right across the board for everybody. Now there's a few disadvantages also. When we start to produce lots and lots more energy, there are effects that I don't think anybody knows yet. We have to investigate all of those effects and phenomena. For example, if you produce excess energy in the vacuum, in space-time, at a point, you actually change the energy density of the space-time in so doing. Now that, by the way, is totally a gravitational change. You have now just done general relativity on the bench. If you make very powerful changes, you have some very startling changes that emerge. You can have gravitational or anti-gravitational changes. It'd be very embarrassing to have a power source that wouldn't stay nailed down to the floor, for example. That's not what you want. You want it to power the home. You might want to build a ship that would fly, but that's a different purpose. So what we are also entering is a great new world of phenomena in physics that we have not explored, we do not have in our textbooks, and nobody has the insight to see all the way through to it. What we can say is economically it'll be a revolution. Culturally it'll be a revolution. Technically it'll be a great revolution. And we hope and pray that for the common person like you and I, for our homes and our automobiles and cleaning up the atmosphere, getting rid of a lot of the pollution and waste, getting rid of the nuclear waste from nuclear power plants, that is going to happen. We have a problem. People often ask why has this taken so long to get out, and why, even today, why are the conventional scientists so opposed to it? Well, there are things which are both reasonable and unreasonable involved in it. Let me just give some of the factors. One of the factors is a straightforward technical factor. When this regauging that I spoke of the electrodynamic equations was done, what you wound up with was a closed system. It actually applied the theory and says all systems that use this theory are closed systems. You are going to have to put as much energy into that system to do work on it, to run it, as you can possibly ever get out. And in fact, it'll have some frictional losses and spillages, and so you're going to have to put a little bit more. In other words, it completely threw away any possibility of doing an over-unity system. Since the scientists thought that was an exact statement, they didn't realize they had thrown away the other classes of systems in doing the regauging. This meant that they all legitimately believed that anything else was smacks of perpetual motion. You're suggesting that a closed system with no input of energy whatsoever can create energy. That's against the fundamental principle of conservation of energy, which is energy can neither be created nor destroyed. You can use it, you can change its form, you can scatter it, but you can't get rid of it and you can't create it. It's as simple as that. So if you suggest that you can create it, that is called perpetual motion, and of course that's nonsense. And so most of the scientists equated any notion of a free energy or over-unity device as being a perpetual motion machine, and therefore utter nonsense. You see, it's a play on words. The scientists interpreted it one way, the guys trying to do it are looking at it as an open system. Now, fortunately today, we have a type of thermodynamics. Nobel Prizes have been issued for it, to Prigogine, for example, for systems not in thermodynamic equilibrium that do have. They're open systems, and the energy does flow in from outside and through them. Those kinds of systems can produce over-unity. It's all perfectly legitimate physics. You do not violate conservation of energy law. You do not violate the laws of physics, and you do not violate the laws of thermodynamics, the nonlinear thermodynamics. What you do violate is the assumption of a closed system thermodynamics, the so-called equilibrium thermodynamics, which says that any energy flows into one part's going to flow out immediately. You can't get any excess accumulation. In fact, you're going to lose energy if you heat it up. So it says you're doomed before you start. Obviously, if you have a system that complies with that, you cannot ever have over-unity. You'll have the conventional systems. So by the unconscious throwing away and discarding of all the systems that did allow you to do that and do it legitimately, the scientists believed firmly in their hearts that they were rejecting nonsense when they rejected any idea of over-unity systems. That's the primary reason. It's strictly a scientific, technical reason. And that was their reasoning. The point is, we are not assuming a closed system. We're assuming an open system. Now, there were other reasons. Financial. If everybody has cheap energy and clean energy, how are you going to tax them for it? This was Morgan's famous statement, you know. How can you put a meter on that? The interests, of course, in the financial community were to sell you energy. That's a large part of the financial cost of all of industry, is the energy that it takes to run it. And so there's a great deal of money to be made. Actually, the same people and companies and so forth, if you will check it, bought up just about all the major energy sources. They own the oil, they own the coal, they own the nuclear power plants, everything that has any real promise they already own. And so what you have then is, I would say, economic cartel, loose-knit thing between various countries and so forth that are oil-rich or energy-rich, to keep the status quo and keep selling you the thing. After all, if we sell you a barrel of oil today and you burn it, we'll sell you a barrel of oil tomorrow, and we keep charging you for it. One of the things that this revolution has posed, or in many people's minds it has posed, is that Einstein's wrong. Well, I would like to change that just a little bit. I think everything we're dealing with right now in its present form is sort of both right and wrong. There are many things right with it. There are many things wrong with it. It's not totally black or white. It's a mixture of gray. Now let's talk about general relativity. In Einstein's day, there was absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of any way to use the electromagnetic force, which is a quite strong force, to produce curvature of space-time, the geometric curvature of space-time, which is what general relativity is all about. So Einstein used the very weak gravitational force, which is about, for electrons, about 10 to the minus 38 or 10 to the minus 40, something like that. It varies the number, 10 to the minus 42, as strong, an extremely weak force. This means if that's all your theory encompasses, you're never going to have an experimental science on the laptop bench, because that's too weak a force. You can't even measure it. You got to go out by a great big sun or a great big star or something like that to bend the light to even have observable effects. You just simply don't crank up and do laboratory experiments in it. I do point out to you that if you involve rotating machines, and pretty powerful ones at that, you do involve full general relativity. That's very uncommon, but it has been done. For example, in electromagnetic machinery, there are a couple of very famous electrodynamicists, probably the best this country has ever produced, who worked in that. And so the work there is very formidable, and it does attempt to combine electromagnetics and full general relativity. So what you're going to find is general relativity is going to change. It isn't going to go away, but it's going to start to use the very strong electrodynamic force as being the medium of curvature, and it's going to turn into an experimental laboratory science and great advances in it. Einstein is not going to wind up wrong. He's going to wind up in part correct, but needing a great deal of extension. That's what's going to happen. Well, there's several questions also, I guess you would say, ancillary questions or of more interest to us as living human beings, that occur when you start talking about dealing with very large packages of energy or a great number more energy sources. In other words, putting a lot more energy loose in the environment. Well, the blunt truth of it is multi-signal, multi-radiation environments, there are some effects which I've specified, for example, to the limit that I know. In a journal called Explore, I gave two-part article on the priori work that was done in France. And I dealt with some of the new kinds of biological effects that you can get from these kinds of things that doesn't appear in the present repertoire, so to speak, of the scientists who are studying effects of EM fields and radiations on living systems. So we do have effects there. We have some long-term cumulative effects. We have to characterize our environment. We have to have lots of experiments to do that. We have to characterize the environment that's going to be resulting as the years go by. And we have to know what we're doing and what's safe and what isn't. That's only going to occur when we turn the normal universities on, the sharp young graduate students, and lots of experiments, and we explore the phenomenology. We have to turn the scientific community on before the research funds will be made available to the universities to do that. And so the first priority in this area, the safety area, is to get the scientific community active in this area, get research funds actually in this exploding area, and also looking at overhaul the models for, which are terrible right now, on EM effects on biological systems. Because there are effects, and there are new effects that we don't even know about yet that we're going to run into, some of which we do suspect and know about right now. But we have to investigate it, and we have to be sure that this is a safe, sane birth of the baby, and we don't just contribute to the problems we've already gotten. That work has to be done, and it too requires a change in the present paradigm, because the present models for EM bio effects is basically the old heating. You know, you heat the tissue or you dump energy in it. The so-called deposition model is basically heating by another name, and if you don't do that, you don't affect the system. That's not true. There are several other mechanisms that give you deep penetration in multi-signal environments, including down to the bone marrow and including into the actual immune stem cells that make all your immune cells in the system. And so there can be very profound effects on human beings in electronic smog and multi-signal environments. We have to explore that much deeper than what the present scientists have allowed it to be explored because of economic impacts. There's another impact which sometimes I hesitate to mention, but I think it's true, and I think it clearly has been shown in some experiments without people thoroughly understanding them. When you add extra dimensionality, or look at the extra dimensionality of it, you can model a living system as a particular extra 3-space attached to this 3-space. So in infinite dimensions, you can have an infinite number of these 7 spaces. And that'll allow you to model a mind actually connected to the living body. Well, that's interesting because it means if you choose the right engineering in this hyperspace, you can engineer the mind directly. And there are some experiments that even imply this. There are some that show that you can do things with cells. For example, you can time reverse the cells back to a previous state and cure diseases. Priori did that. And several other researchers have shown aspects of it. Robert Becker, for example, was nominated for a Nobel Prize for showing little tiny DC currents and little DC potentials we can separate into this stuff by, you know, applying the Whittaker approach, decomposition. He showed very conclusively that you can just take cells and reverse them backwards to a previous state or forward to a future state, called differentiation and dedifferentiation. He should have been given a Nobel Prize for that work. That's magnificent work. It's a tragedy that he wasn't. But we have effects which can get down now into the very fundamental thing that drives everything, the mind stuff, the connection of the mind to the body and everything. For example, if you were to generate extreme pulses, extreme powerful pulses of this so-called scalar potential stuff with the hidden internal stuff, if you jerk that or hard enough, you jerk the normal smooth flow of time stream, and what you really do is you snap the body loose from its mind connection. You jerk the two loose from each other. That's instantaneous death at every level. Every cell dies, every germ dies, every paramecium dies, every virus dies, the whole body dies. So obviously if you're going to try to think of energy in those enormous amounts, you're going to have to be extremely careful. You can't do that just willy-nilly without risking terrible effects from it. So there are some limitations that will emerge on this technology, and those are the things that we must experiment with and understand and control from the very beginning. We've got to get those scientists and those sharp young graduate students working that out. And the other question that arises is this thing we're calling loosely out there zero-point energy. What in the world is zero-point energy? Well, the notion is that when you cool something in temperature down to absolute zero, no motion, actually the motion doesn't go away, according to quantum mechanics, standard theory. You have temporary quantum mechanical prescribed motions that can emerge and continue and do. For example, a thing can move all by itself instantaneously with extreme velocity and extreme energy for just a moment, and then it has to cut off and go away. If it stays very long, then it's observable. But if it's quick enough, you can have an energetic thing born, and that's called the so-called virtual particle flux of the vacuum in quantum field theory. And that also is what the zero-point energy is. The energy remaining, when you get down to say that normally all the classical motion ought to be gone, but there's still lots of energy left there, and that's what it consists of. So there's a wedding of the two down at that level, and that's the level of energy that is so fierce that bombards every charged particle in the universe and drives everything. In fact, everything we get comes from that. And for the first time, we're now dealing directly with that energy as the source of what we're trying to do. Yes, both matter and antimatter are included in the particles. You see, you have a particle and you have an antiparticle, all being born furiously and disappearing furiously in the quantum mechanical vacuum all the time. And that violent flux of particles and antiparticles is what makes up the so-called virtual particle flux of vacuum, which in turn makes up what we call classically the zero-point energy vacuum. And so there's lots and lots and lots of energy there, as we pointed out, incredible amounts of it, but it's in this very peculiar form. But it does drive everything else in the universe, including all the living systems. Now, what we get into in the realm of dimensionality, we get into some very peculiar questions. We have, for example, the wave-particle duality problem that hadn't been resolved. The physicists just shake hands and agreed to quit arguing, but nature is happy to be both wave and particle at the same time, and we try to insist that it's either wave or particle. Well, what you do for that, for modeling purposes, the best way to do that is use 7 space. Use 3 hyperdimensions, 3 normal space dimensions, and a common time dimension between the two. Put your hidden wave stuff, the Whittaker, Joukowsky, Stoney stuff, up in the hyperspaces. That's where it's a perfectly set of organized bidirectional waves. And put your particle flux down in your normal old Minkowski space, which is where the quantum physicists already put it. But now you have a very magic thing. You have the fact that there's perfect order up in hyperspace, and all this stuff in the vacuum is perfectly ordered. You run headlong into Hal Puthoff's cosmological feedback principle, and he's right. It's absolutely ordered. But if you have something that's changing at, say, 10 to the 120th times a second for one particle bombarding another charged particle, you have no information on those individual actions at all, and it's so fast you can't even gather the information. So you have to approach it statistically. You have to approach it with statistical methods. And so it doesn't look like it's ordered, but the hidden order is in there, and it does obey Puthoff's cosmological principle. So you use a 7 space to model scalar potential in the first place. In taking a look at what I seriously think is the immediately progressing advent of over-unity systems and even self-powered systems where you have a closed-loop feedback, there are some statements I think we can speculate on pretty safely. One is we'll really have a true science when it is accepted in science, and a true technology when all the phenomenology is thoroughly worked out and thoroughly understood, when all the models are redone so that we adequately can model this theoretically and we can do engineering. We can sit down and design the circuits. They'll work every time. We'll have components on the shelf we can buy, assemble, and they work. We're not at that stage today. We are at a stage today which is the birth of the baby. We're not at the stage where it's already a teenager running around playing baseball on the baseball lot. We're at the birth of the baby, and the birth is very difficult because it's opposed by so many interests. The orthodox scientific community still very adamantly oppose it because they think that it's nonsense. They think that it's this old idea of perpetual motion in a closed system, creating energy from nothing. And that is nonsense. You can't do that. There are very strong and very powerful economic interests in the world, probably the strongest economic interest in the world, which are adamantly opposed to it. Can you see what this does to the oil-rich nations? Can you see, eventually, can you see what this will do to many things? Now, actually, what it'll do, you'll phase the oil. Petrochemical industry won't go away. You still need the oil for the materials that's in it and the chemicals. And so it'll be more and more petrochemical industry rather than keep burning and wasting the oil and putting all the pollutants in the biosphere. So many things will readjust. It's going to wrest control from a lot of the great wealthy control barons who now dominate largely the economic world. And their world is going to change. Now, what you're going to see, I would predict, and we'll see if history bears this out, when those barons really realize that this stuff is for real and it can be made to work, and with the internet and with free publishing and computers and everything, they can no longer contain the information, and it's very embarrassing to keep killing the inventors. They stopped that about 15 years ago. At some point, you're going to see an overwhelming availability of funds become available. When the funds become available, the scientists will change over into it because they go where the money goes. They're bought and paid for, simple as that. You can't do research unless you got the funds. You cut off the research grants, professor gets without a job. He leaves the university. And so science is simply bought and paid for in this country and much of the world. When the money goes, the science will go to it. Now that will put the sharp young graduate student on it finally with some funds to do the experiments and work on their doctorates and so forth. You will have a very rapid assimilation and advancement of a totally new and extended electromagnetic science at the time. That's what's going to happen, I think.
Concepts you've just witnessed. Now you can get even more valuable information and details from the new Energy series. 5 full-length videos, 9 hours of in-depth conversations and demonstrations of free energy systems. Explore the worlds of inventors and theoretical physicists who are changing the paradigms of science. Volume 1 features Tom Bearden.
In particle physics, any electrical charge is automatically a broken symmetry. Now what this means is there is a virtual photon flux, a violent flux exchange between the vacuum itself, which is filled with this virtual photon flux.
Volume 2, John Hutchison.
I feel that that is also true. I think the Mayan can act as also a cohere of frequencies and transmit them out, and then walk this doorway into space and time.
This motor here drew 12.5 amps.
Volume 3, Joseph Newman.
This motor right here only draws 7.5 amps. And look at the size of the propeller. Look at the size of the propeller. Look at the size of the motor. Look at the size of the motor. Now this is exactly what I teach throughout my book. I taught it to Dr. Hastings. I've taught it to the world. That the larger you make the mass, then the smaller amount of power it will take and the more power it will produce.
Volume 4 highlights Troy Reed.
This is an old mechanical device. It's got 2 inner wheels on the inside, 2 outer shell wheels with magnets. They got 8 magnets on this side, 8 magnets on the inside here.
Let's see what kind of torque we got at 75 psi.
Volume 5, Dennis Lee.
Okay, here goes. Maxed it out. So it went all the way off the end of this thing, 150 foot-pounds of torque. This engine.
They're just $29.95 for each tape.
Now the
or get all 5 for $119.95, a savings of $30. Place your order today. Call 1-800-795-TAPE, T-A-P-E. Or write to Lightworks Audio and Video, Post Office Box 661593, Los Angeles, California, 90066. And now you can order this and many other fine tapes on the internet at www.lightworksav.com. That's lightworksav.com, as in Lightworks Audio and Video.